So Deborah, we're talking about a developmental relational approach for teachers. And I know where we're going with some of this discussion. So before we do, I want to like talk a little bit about the increased burden that we're placing on teachers.
I think teachers have such a difficult job, and such an important job in our society. Really, they're the channel for socialization of children and youth, helping them understand how to become full citizens. And yet, they're classrooms with 30 children in them. And the 30 children are all different in so many ways, with different learning abilities, different interests, different family backgrounds, different cultures. And, you know, on one hand, it's sort of like working an orchestra, but no, it's not, because there's a violin section or there's a horn section. In this case, you're dealing with so many different individuals with so many different needs. So I think that as a society, we have to have a lot of appreciation and compassion for teachers and the work that they do.
I wanted to address that off the bat because I know that the goal that you believe teachers should have for their role might not be the one that all teachers have been trained in, might not even be the one that their schooling always prepared them for, or that society has cast them in. So what do you think the goal for a teacher should be?
Well, I think that education should be for the whole child, not just for the academic functioning of the child. And yet there are real constraints on that, in that the standardized international testing tests math skills and literacy skills and science skills. Right. And so those are the data that come back to a school. Those are the data that come back to a classroom. Those are the ways that education systems are being measured and teachers are being measured.
Right.
And yet there's so much more to development than literacy and numeracy and science knowledge. And so I think teachers have the opportunity to create a social experience in the classroom that promotes diverse types of learning. And I think that we often don't recognize that learning is really a social experience. Right. And schools are essentially social institutions in which teachers are responsible for the experiences that students have in their four walls.
And before we talk about exactly how that occurs, I want to talk about a couple other caveats that you and I agreed to before this. Some guiding principles for this, because I know from working with schools that the last thing that many teachers want to hear is another thing that they need to work on, right? So I want them to know that some of these guiding principles for this particular session. One is your belief, established in your research, that it's never too late to catch up developmentally for the teachers and the students. So I want them to know what you mean by that, in case anything that they hear during this, they think, oh, I've never done that. It's too late. So what do you mean that it's never too late to catch up developmentally for teachers or for students?
Yeah. Let's start with the teachers. And you mentioned teacher training.
Yeah.
I did that. I did a year of training to get my Bachelor of Education, and I learned how to set up a curriculum. I learned some classroom management strategies, and I learned about the different subjects I was going to be teaching. The only thing I didn't learn about was children. And that was really disappointing for me. And I think that teachers can learn so much through their observations. You know, they have opportunities to see children in different contexts with different tasks in front of them, in structured activities, in non-structured activities, after, a day when the child's tired and a day when the child's at their best. And I think the work to understand children's development and how relationships operate in children's lives is something that teachers can really move forward on. And I love talking to well-established teachers and, the methods that they use to engage students who are disengaged, or the methods that they use to, ensure that everybody's leaving the classroom in a pretty good mood, or entering the classroom in a pretty good mood, like standing there and welcoming students. Like, they can learn different strategies to just enhance the social and emotional experiences that students have in their classes.
Well, we definitely are going to cover why enhancing the social and emotional development of the children is compatible with those other measures like reading scores and math scores. But before we do, I also want to point out two other guiding principles of this session. One, the next one, number 2, is it's never too late to repair. What do you mean by that?
We talked about this in the parent session quite a bit, and I think the same thing holds true with teachers. Each of us moves about our days as in the best ways that we can. And sometimes we're tired, sometimes a child just touches a nerve for us. We react rather than spending a little bit of time to calm down and be proactive and thoughtful in engaging. And I think being a teacher and being a parent requires some humility. It's not always going to go right. It's certainly not always going to go right with all the children. And if it hasn't gone right and you feel that you haven't quite done your best on a given day, it's absolutely acceptable and even advisable to go back and repair. Because if you go back and say, John, the way I talked to you yesterday, I wasn't at my best. I don't think I used my best tone of voice. Right. What I really meant to say was, and what I was really thinking, and what I really need to understand is, and that changes not only your softness in your interaction with the child, but the way that child sees you. Oh, this is somebody who's stopped to think and is actually recognizing the harm that I felt yesterday. So I think that there's a tremendous value in repair, and we don't talk about that much as a society. Repair requires humility, and in a highly competitive society, we don't talk very much about humility. And yet it's just an important tool to ensure that interactions are going well, and that when something's out of step and gone wrong, you just realign it.
Well, how else does a student learn to apologize if they haven't experienced somebody else doing it, right?
I know, it's so interesting to think about that, because, a teacher might say, don't use those words, or don't use that tone of voice. And it's like, but wait a minute, you just did.
Yeah.
And children are really smart, and they watch us. It's as if the teacher's on stage. The students are watching all the time to see what the teacher's doing. And so if the teacher says, Susan, you're being so stupid today, it gives everybody in the class permission to do that. So, it's thinking about those things and being aware of your own thoughts, but also giving yourself permission to take the 10 seconds that it takes to calm down and be sure you're responding in a way that is the way you want to respond.
The final guiding principle of this particular session on developmental relational approaches for teachers is that there's no such thing as a perfect teacher.
No, there's no such thing as a perfect teacher. And it's interesting to think about, because, perfect can be defined on so many levels. And it, a perfect teacher is probably somewhere in the middle of, from very strict and very authoritarian to very permissive, because neither of those extremes is particularly good. And yet a given teacher on a certain day might be quite authoritarian because that's just what they can manage that day, or they might be exhausted to be very permissive. And so, it's interesting that we as adults can vary and children can vary, but aiming for perfect isn't really what we want to do. And this is, I think, where self-compassion comes in, where you say, oh, I've had a difficult day. I'm just going to give myself a little bit of permission to let the students read on their own for the last half hour of the class or something like that.
And again, we recognize that teachers are not necessarily being rewarded for the social and emotional development of their students, or at least it's not obvious. But you've written, and I want to quote here, there is mounting evidence that students' attachments to teachers and their engagement or connection with schools are related not only to their academic achievement, but also to their social, moral, and behavioral development. But those things, the attachment to the teacher and the feeling of connectedness with the school, is related to their academic achievement. Yeah. So talk a little bit about that. In particular, let's start with, what does it mean to feel attached to a teacher?
It's not unlike attachment in the general sense of parent-child attachment. You feel that the teacher values you and cares for you, and that the teacher is trustworthy, and is out for your best interests, sees you as an individual and is out for your best interest. And when a child or adolescent feels that way, they're likely to be willing to work a little harder. This person cares for me, and so I want to do my best. It's going to take a bit of effort, but I'm going to do my best. Whereas if you don't feel the teacher cares for you, and in fact doesn't really care at all, would rather not have you in the class, that's going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. You're going to make it so that you're not in the class. So having an attachment to the teacher means that you're in a caring relationship with the teacher. You care about the teacher and the teacher cares about you.
You've also noted, as other researchers have, that the importance of that attachment and connection to the school only grows as a student ages through their education experience.
Yes, it grows, and that's really important for the hard work we ask students to do. If you think about it, we ask them to go through the door of a school at 8:30 or 9 o'clock, whatever time in the morning, and sit in a desk and do things that don't really relate to their everyday excitement and interests at that age. And we're building and scaffolding and preparing them for any number of futures, but it's not always fun. In fact, it's often not fun. And so we need students to be motivated and to feel that people care about the efforts that they make. And how do you, I think the question is, how do you know people care? How do you know your teacher cares? How do you know anybody in the school cares? And one of the questions that's often asked in research is, if you were sick and absent from school for a day or two, would anybody notice? And it's the children who say nobody would notice who are the ones we should worry about the most. They're just not seen. So there are some interventions that are remarkably simple, such as a principal standing at the door of the school and welcoming the children in and trying their best to call the child by name makes a huge difference to the child's sense of engagement and connection to the school. Or the teacher standing at the door as the students come in and remembering that a student got braces put on last week and ask how that is, or went away for the weekend. Just giving that child a sense, I see you and you're important to me.
Well, and you and I have talked about this many times. That check-in, that morning check-in at the door, if you're with that student all day, or just as they're coming into your class, if you only have them from the period, not only gives that student information about how you feel about them, but you as a teacher get information about where they are as well. And why might that be important?
Do you know, it would be important in terms of your expectation for that student and your understanding of how that student's managing in the class that day. And if a student's having a really off day, it might not be the day to ask them to stand up and read in front of the class or perform or something. It's being attuned, and I think that one of the ways that teachers can be most attuned is by observing, observing what's happening in the class, observing, the students who are attentive, those who aren't, and why are the students not attentive? Are they at the back messing about?
Right.
It's interesting. I decided on a term called social architecture, if I can just take a side. When my eldest son was in grade 13, just leaving high school, he took physics. And we met, you have a 5-minute interview with the teacher, and the teacher said, "Your son is a pillar in our physics class." I went, "Oh no, this teacher's really got the wrong student here," because my son wasn't a pillar in physics. And he said, no, he is. He said, "In every class I teach, there are about 7 or 8 students in a class of 25 or something who I call my pillars. They're paying attention. They're doing the tasks, they're responsible doing the experiments, they've done the homework, they come into class prepared. I call them my pillars." And then the back of the class, they're kids who are really disruptive, that are messing about with the experiment, aren't paying any attention, aren't doing anything, and are really causing problems. I said, I rearrange the class every 2 or 3 weeks. And the students come in, I say, "Here's the new seating plan. Please take your seats and we'll be ready to learn." "Well, I don't want to sit there." No, that's the seating plan. And what he does is he puts a pillar between the students who are being disruptive. And so he created the social learning context that minimized disruption and maximized the attentiveness and the engagement in the learning. And would then see, where the disruption was, and then move the pillars around. And it was highly successful. And it gave me the notion that when we think about classrooms, we often think about the physical environment of the classroom. Like, do I have interesting pictures up or maps of, what we're studying? But there's a social environment in the classroom that we as adults can be responsible for, because we know a lot about what happens when deviant peers get together. They just become more deviant. They reinforce each other and become more deviant. You want to be sure those students aren't together in your classroom, or it's going to be really out of control. And this is one way of doing it, is just, moving students around and not making it explicit, not saying, not saying, "Well, you're the good kid, so you've got to go and sit over by those bad kids."
But it's also just a chance that the positive framing of that would be, it gives those other students a chance to learn a behavior that's more successful in the classroom.
That's right.
So one of the tools that teachers have that you just mentioned is being present, understand where their students are at, checking in with them, allowing the students to know that they're valued by the teacher. You've talked about the value of the physical structure of the class. You can rearrange and socially architect the students. You also advocate, though, for creating spaces in classrooms that serve special needs of students.
I do. And I find it very helpful to think about how we go through our day.
Right.
And, there are moments in my day when I'm highly attuned and tuned in, and there are other moments when I just need a bit of time to do that. And for children, those are very real moments as well. And especially when it comes to regulation, which emotional and behavioral regulation are absolutely essential for learning. They're the foundation of learning. And a child may come through the door of a classroom and be completely dysregulated. Not because of anything that's happened in the classroom or anything that's happened at the school, but something that happened last night,
Yeah.
or the week before, or they were just bullied as they walked to school that day. So I think it's really important to give children permission and space and time to regulate if they're dysregulated, and not to require that they come and actively participate if they're not able to at
Right.
that moment. Now, does that create disruption in the classroom? A little bit. But can you have, particularly in elementary school classrooms, can you have an area at the back that's got a bookshelf and has a little, some cushions and has a little separated so that a child could feel sad and sit and look at a book or listen to some music quietly and be ready to come after? You always probably want to talk to the child before re-entering with that child, but mostly to tune in and find out what's happening and what the child can let you know about the difficulties they're experiencing that day. But I think it's really important to recognize that every child is different, and some have different learning disabilities that can be accommodated, but others just have daily experiences that destabilize them. And
I'm keen to convince people listening to this that these things that you're advocating for do actually make the teacher's job easier, even if it's requiring them to maybe engage in practices that they haven't before. And let's go back to something you just said. It might be a little disruptive to allow a student to leave a larger discussion and go to an area in the classroom where they can take some time alone. But you've built a career observing students in these environments. How disruptive is it if too much pressure is put on that student and they don't have a chance to regulate?
it's such a good observation and a good question. If you don't attune to a child's emotional state, or emotional and behavioral state, and you press that child to do something the child's not ready to do, particularly a performance, because there's nothing that's more stressful than having to perform in front of, a group of peers. The potential for that to really undermine the child's sense of self-efficacy and accomplishment is huge. And not only that, but that child's being observed by those other, 25 sets of eyes, and they will see the child fail. And it sets the child up to have a negative peer reputation. And what we know about peer reputations is they're remarkably stable. Once a child has a negative peer reputation, it takes quite a lot to shift that.
It often doesn't shift until they move away from that group into a different school.
That's right, that's right. And teachers have so much power in terms of that. Right. So much power to help other children see the children who are different in a positive way. And every child has strengths, and every child can add to the well-being of the classroom or the positive experience of the classroom. They may be a great drawer, they may be good on the computer, they may have just a beautiful smile, and they can be the welcomer at the door. And it's really finding the ways to point that out and appreciate each child in the class, particularly those who are at the margins, and you can quickly see who those are because they're not chosen.
So interesting that you mentioned power, because, and again, I want to go back to what you believe the goal for the teacher should be. And I also want to go back to this other tool that we explore a lot in the foundational video and a session that's part of this series. And that is this metacognition. This is acknowledging your own thoughts and regulating your own behaviors before you interact with a student. And we go over that a lot. I mention that, and here I am going to be critical of some teachers, but it's only because I've read so many incident reports in schools. And what I see, because you mentioned power, is I see too often teachers believe that the interaction is about their control over the classroom. And they set their control as the goal. I have to show that I'm in control. And it's a strange goal because it almost, like, especially if you're reading incident reports, it never actually looks like the teacher's in control the way that they end up. So we're asking teachers to shift from this idea that they need to control students' behavior to ones where they need to point it to success. What is that? What I mean, what's the shift here, Deborah?
I think the shift is from power over to power with.
Okay.
And power over is that control. It's my classroom. You do as I say. We're going to get this done. I'm doing my job. I'm teaching you X.
Right.
Power with really recognizes the agency of children and youth. And if you look at the UN Convention of Rights of the Child, children have a lot of rights to agency and to voice and to participation and to engagement and to decision making. And so if we were going to have a child rights respecting classroom, it would be one where the children don't get to plan the curriculum because that's planned, but they do get to choose activities related to the curriculum that's of interest to them. They do get to work in groups if they prefer that rather than all on their own. Great to teach cooperation. They do get, some say they do get to express what they like and don't like. This is a very different view of childhood, that that children aren't chattels to be moved around and fixed so that they're ready to go out into the world, but that they're evolving beings, and the more they learn how to share power with and engage and lead and share in decision making, the better they'll be as citizens as they move out into the world.
But it also, it's not this either or thing. I mean, some of the most calm classrooms I've seen where the students responded to the slightest shift in command or gesture from a teacher was because they felt so connected to that classroom. They felt that absolute attachment to that teacher. They weren't seen as adversarial. They would do nothing to undermine that connection. And so they followed direction more readily, it seemed to me.
Yes. Yeah, because you're seen. Children need to feel seen, and if you're not seen, you're not connected. You're not in relationship. And I think it's that. And also, children have investment in the learning process. They're there every day. They work so hard. And so if we recognize that investment and support their engagement in the learning, I think it makes a difference. And it just makes a difference in terms of motivation to be there, to turn up the door. And as you say, it's the relationships that the teacher nurtures within the classroom, not only between him or her and the students, but also among the students.
We have some really good research about what that strong attachment between a teacher and a student can accomplish. I want to go back, though, to a concept that we explored in the first video, but also in a video on developmental relational approaches for parents. And that's something that you call this bidirectional interaction, this feedback loop that happens when a teacher has negative expectations of a student.
Yeah. Do you know, kids are smart, and they pick those up. If we don't like a student, they pick it up so quickly. And from a very young age, they know that. And you work hard to stay connected to people who value you. And I think the issue in this case is that not only does the child know that the teacher has a negative attitude, but everybody else in the classroom does too. Because even if the teacher is using words that are more or less positive, the tone of voice tells the story, the eyes tell the story, the body language tells the story, and everybody feels it. And so it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. The child learns that it doesn't matter what I do right. It's when I do something wrong that I get noticed, I get seen, I exist here. So it is the case that there's this, it's a cycle that keeps repeating itself and degrading. And sometimes it's just not a good fit. It's just not the right teacher with the right child.
Absolutely, but it's also, the same mechanisms that allow for that interaction to spiral downward can spiral upward as well.
They do. And then, you talked about, the success, that just success breeds success. And that for a teacher is seeing that child's special talent. And the child may have a learning disability, but is fantastic at, organizing, or is fantastic at music or art, and could, can really be celebrated. And I think each child can be celebrated for what they do best. And schools should be a place where children are celebrated.
And I know that, again, we addressed this in greater depth than in other parts of this series, but again, for the teachers in particular, talk about how it might be valuable to them to look at how they feel about that student before they engage in that interaction. How they're thinking in that moment will be received, and what kind of outcomes they can get just by changing how they feel about that student.
It's that we as adults need to regulate as well as the students need to regulate. And in a moment when a student is just doing things that are driving the teacher to distraction, literally, it's so important to just pause, and take a deep breath. And what seems like a long pregnant pause for you is not so long for the students. They'll know that something's happening. So first regulate them, first connect to them with a positive tone of voice, and then try to regulate by co-regulating them, staying regulated yourself, and separating them if it's a group of children, and then coming back later when everybody's a little more regulated, and addressing the issue and asking, like, what was happening there, and how did it, how did it get off the rails, and help me understand what the problem was.
And this is why I think that it's useful to teachers hear what you know about adaptive behaviors. This notion that students aren't acting this way, first of all, to offend the teacher, but all of the behaviors are, well, they're learned, right?
It's so interesting when we step back and think about species in general and species survival. And, every species adapts in a way that maximizes their survival. And in some cases, when we think about children with behavior problems, they adapt in ways that we don't think are very adaptive. So it's a hard word to use. But they respond to the situation in ways that are difficult for those around them. They may respond with a temper tantrum. They may respond with kicking and hitting. They may respond with totally shutting down and not talking at all. And for them in the moment, in their mind, that's a good response, because it's getting them what they want. They want to be connected in some way, even if it's a negative connection. They want to be seen, or they want to totally withdraw and just be undisturbed. And when we see a child acting out, there could be a tendency to say, oh, that child was, on the edge last week and is really going to get me, like is doing this to get me this week. And I don't think that children or adolescents are A, that interested in teachers and getting them, and B, that thoughtful about what I can do in the moment that's going to most drive that teacher to distraction. So I think it's important just to step back and think about the child and the child's developmental capacities, but often also, your relationship with the child and the peer relationships. I often think of this, and we talked about this earlier, as a pair of binoculars that, in one set of binoculars, it's like, what are this child's strengths and what are the challenges? But what has this child not learned that I really expect that child to come through the door with? Yeah. And also, what if they learned that really we didn't want them to learn because their lives haven't been as predictable and nurturing and supportive as they could be? And then shift there to say, well, like, how's my relationship with the child? Do I have any idea how the parents relate to this child? How is the sibling with this child? A really older sibling who's into lots of trouble.
How's the neighborhood? How's the society? How's the community?
Exactly. And, and at a proximal level, how do other children in this classroom teach that child, treat that child? Because if that child's not being treated kindly by the other kids in the class, there is very little chance that child will learn it and behave at an optimal level.
A phrase that has not gone away is they should know better. And my response is always, how? Why? They're children. If they haven't been taught better, then how would they know better? And this is, as sensitive as I am to the plight of teachers, I don't want to scare them, but it's also pretty clear in your research that at some level, schools are our last resort for some of these children. This idea, we talk about rejection sensitivity. If they aren't accepted, if they haven't found support in their home or community from primary care providers, if they haven't found it from peers, it's often left to the teacher.
It is. It's the last resort, and it's sometimes the safest place. Yeah. It's sometimes the safest place for children. And that's what we want schools to be. We want them to be this place where children are happy to come through the door, that they feel that they matter, they feel they belong, they feel it's their school, their place. And it's so important. We're learning more and more after, the isolation of COVID. We're learning more and more about the importance of social relationships and how really detrimental isolation is. And so school's a place where you can build friendships, or at least build peer relationships where others interact with that child and learn how to welcome that child's strengths into an activity. So it makes me think, if I can just, it makes me think about a teacher organizing, social skills or social science project, or a baseball game. And okay, for the project, everybody get into groups of 3, or baseball, choose your teams, and then there's one child left out, or 2 children left out. Well, you have to take Mary. No way, I had her last week. Not a chance I'm taking her. She's useless. And so there again, I think it's social architecture. Don't let the children choose, because you will watch the peer dynamics, you will watch the peer reputations unfold in front of your eyes. And always the least accepted children will be the ones who don't ever get chosen. And they deserve to be chosen. They deserve to be included. Every child has a right to be included. And so as a teacher, do something random. Pass out sheets, pass out cards, do something that gets random groupings. And then, you're so lucky to have Mary. Do she is the one who does the best printing, or whatever it is. She's so good on the computer, you guys. And there are ways of just, that don't take much, but they do take a lot of thought.
And they can be genuine.
Oh, they can be genuine.
We're
Absolutely.
not talking, I know there's the much, blind participation trophy. That's not what we're asking teachers to do. That's not what you're asking. You're asking them to recognize something that is really valuable about that child and showing it to the other students in the classroom.
Yes.
Right? You also notice, and because I fear putting too much of a burden on our teachers, but when a teacher demonstrates value in a student, you've written that then the other students see that value. And now it's not just the teacher is the only one that values that student. Now that student has peer relationships, right?
Yes, and that's because the teacher is in charge of the quality of the social relationships in the classroom. And often we don't think about classrooms. Well, they just put kids together, and some thought may go into not putting certain children in the same classroom, but generally they're in the classroom and you teach them. But really helping the children see the wonderful things about each other. And the teacher is, in some sense, the conductor of that, because the teacher, through observation and through testing, the normal types of testing that go on, knows children's strengths and weaknesses and can highlight those to the others, so that this isn't seen as a child who's always at the back and never able to complete the tests, or never, always asking for help. So, every child has strengths.
Well, and you point to some very good research that demonstrates, in your own writing, you've pointed to other people's research that demonstrates that a strong relationship with the teacher and with the other peers, a strong connection with the classroom, overcomes like even natural ability in terms of academic performance.
Yes. I think it has to do with motivation. So there's natural ability, but if you're not motivated to engage, that ability just stays pretty dormant. It might perform, a child might perform and do the work that's required. But if you think the teacher cares about you, and the other children, see your strengths and are rooting for you, you'll just work your buns off. And so it increases the what's called the zone of development, where the child can really achieve in a really positive way.
I know how frustrated teachers are sometimes with behaviors that they see in their classroom that they have a hard time managing. And we've already talked about how it's important to look at your own thoughts about the students that you're dealing with. But I think it's important, and it might be helpful for the teachers to know that in some of these students, there's an actual physical change that's occurred in their brain that is correlated with some of these capacities that they're seeing in the classroom. Can you talk about that?
I'd be glad to. It has lots to do with, again, we go back to regulation and co-regulation. So children are highly disruptive, aggressive, and not doing the tasks at hand in the classroom are difficult for teachers to manage. But what we know from working with neuropsychologists and the children within the SNAP program at the Child Development Institute is that these children's brains haven't developed in the same way as typically developing children. So when the neuropsychologists put this type of child into a task that's very frustrating at one point, we can see real differences between their brain activity and the brain activity of typically developing children. And the difference is that the emotional centers of the brain light up a lot on these EEGs. And show that the children are highly frustrated, highly emotionally aroused. And at the same time, the executive functioning areas of the brain aren't activated. Right. They just aren't activated. And they're required for the type of task that the child is doing. They have to monitor their behavior, control their responses, not respond at a certain point. And the connections between these areas of the brain haven't been established through interactions at home, in school beforehand. And what we can see looking before the SNAP program, which is a 12-week program for aggressive children and their parents. And after the 12-week program, for the children who've improved in their behavior, the activity in the emotional areas of the brain is dampened, and the activity in the executive functioning areas of the brain is much more pronounced. So in talking to other neuropsychologists about this, it seems as if the neural pathway that's needed for the executive functioning area of the brain to dampen down and take control of the emotions has started to form during this 12 weeks of training. So again, this is the developmental perspective. Let's look at the child and see what's developed and what hasn't developed. And then think about how we can, whether we're parents or teachers or others, work in a way through co-regulation, through specific training, help that child calm down, start to think and plan rather than just react.
There's two things in that I want to emphasize, because implicit in what you're talking about, kind of a compromised executive function, is executive function also controls one's ability to understand consequences.
Yes.
If you think about how teachers are typically trained, they're typically trained to present consequences for behaviors that are unwanted in the classroom. But if I understand the neuroscience correctly, they are explaining consequences to a child potentially that cannot physically understand consequences, that their brain is no longer able to function that way, which I think really does speak to a need for different kinds of skills, right?
That's right. That you're absolutely right. So a child who's highly aroused, and there are all sorts of things that trigger children who are dysregulated. And it might be being asked to do a task that they really feel uncomfortable. It might be something that a peer did. But once they're highly aroused, it's as if their brain is just flooded with that. And they literally cannot think logically and think about the consequences. If I do this, then that will happen. And so trying to talk to a child and reason with the child in that moment when the child's highly aroused is just not going to be effective. And so helping the child calm down, and then taking 5 minutes at recess or lunch and talking it through and coaching the child, helping the child think what he or she can do differently next time.
The other piece that I want to make sure that people understand, because I know that in some of the early scientific or neuroscientific studies of brain differences, that there were people that were struggling with this idea of biological predeterminism, that if the brain wasn't functioning that it in a certain way, that it never would. But the new research suggests that with the right training, that we can create those different pathways.
It's right, and it was really surprising. And the clinicians were so excited to learn that what they were doing was actually laying down these channels that children needed, these neural pathways that children needed. But if you step back and think about it, it's like, well, the behavior that we see from a child is really about something that's happening in the brain. So it's not surprising if the child's behavior is improving, that the brain structures, the brain architecture is also changing. But I think it's so hopeful to think that you can give a child and parents, because the parents are always involved in the training, give children and parents 12 weeks of training, and it starts to change brain architecture.
And it goes back to one of your guiding principles, which is it's never too late to repair. It also speaks to this other phenomenon that's in, if I'm using the right term, that's in the literature that you hold very dear and very close to you, which is the power of one individual.
There have been several longitudinal studies of children who are troubled or dysregulated and struggling in the school context. And what comes out of these studies that I again think is so helpful is that one caring adult can shift a child off a troubled trajectory onto a positive one. And the power of that adult who is able to tune in and relate to the child and be responsive to the child and see the child's developmental strengths and challenges and relate to that child in a caring way, that adult can make a difference. And so in the school context, when there are children who are struggling, and this is often done in high schools or middle schools, the work with the student who's experiencing difficulties is sometimes to say, who's the adult in this school that you would go to when you were in trouble? Who's the adult you trust? Who's the adult, as we've talked about, that you have a healthy relationship with, who makes you feel valued and supports you and understands you? And then they make arrangements for that adult to be a mentor. And it sort of represents that one caring adult can make a difference for a child or youth.
I really appreciate what you talk about with the healthy minute-to-minute interactions, because I think that even with the caveats that we expressed at the beginning of this session, I have to believe that there are educators out there that are feeling overwhelmed by all of the pressures that are put on them, and then in some ways, we just overwhelm them by further explaining the power that they have, their importance in the life of a student. But you believe that it's accomplished in discrete moments, that it's not something that you necessarily have to plan out in a large multi-month arc, but it can be accomplished in what you call healthy minute-to-minute interactions.
And I think we do. We have lesson plans and curricula that tell about the whole thing. But in the end, in a classroom, you have children in front of you. And it's not that you have moments with every child every day, but if a child's done something really wonderfully, taking time in that moment to acknowledge the child, Jane, I saw that you had really worked hard on your project. I appreciated that so much. Good for you. Or a child who's really struggling, why don't you just take a break for a minute? It looks like you're really having a hard time. And just go and give yourself 5 minutes and sit back there. And I understand, sometimes we all have hard times. Just being present in that moment with the child. And for children who are struggling in a classroom, whether they're struggling academically or struggling in a social emotional way, those moments of confirmation, of being seen, of having their feelings acknowledged, being connected to the adult, like this adult cares, those accumulate over time to make that child feel more and more as if he or she matters in the classroom, and as if they belong in the classroom. And when they feel those things, they're motivated to work hard.
Something that we haven't addressed yet that I know that you believe in deeply is allowing for and creating norms around failure.
Yeah.
And I couldn't help but think about that when you're talking about those interactions, like this notion that if you are allowing a child a break from an assignment, that should be the norm in the classroom, just as mistakes and a chance to do it again are. Why is failure and allowing for failure so important?
I think it's important because we all fail.
Yeah.
We all fail. And we fail especially when we're trying hard things or trying new things. And if we as adults pretend that we never fail and that we never make mistakes and never need to repair, then children are given an unrealistic model of what it's like to move ahead in the world. And so acknowledging failure helps children recognize that it's the very best way to learn sometimes. Yeah. It's, I struggled with this. You had a hard time, but why don't we just spend 5 minutes and I'll help you see the little places that, you can do better next time. And it's like the moment-to-moment work that everything accumulates. So one bad mark, doesn't
Right.
really matter. The other thing is sometimes, I'm not sure about our grading system, and this is sort of well beyond the teachers, but there's, you either fail or you succeed. Whereas if we gave children feedback on their failures and let them try again with the learning they'd made based on their failures so that they could do better on the same task a second time, it might be a good way to practice. So I'm sure some teachers do that, and some tests and assignments are built that way. But I do think that education can be formative in that way, that you learn from your mistakes as well as from your successes.
I mean, I think you have to, right? If we aren't allowing for mistakes, we also run the risk of people not taking the risks that result in I know that we are in this an economy that constantly strives for innovation. Well, you can't have innovation unless you're pushing the boundaries, and that invariably comes with failures, I think. And so allowing those failures to be shared and to be seen and to sometimes be celebrated, I think, is missing from our classrooms.
I think your notion that risk and failure is really important for innovation is very informative. And as a scientist, as a researcher, I've had failures, and some of my failures and recovery from failures have been my most successful enterprises or projects. And one was the failure to show change through social skills training, and that led me out to observing what was really happening on the school playground and opened up our learning all about peer relationships and aggressive children and bullying. So I know that many scientists acknowledge that their successes come from failures. So accepting that children are going to fail and helping them understand that and learn from it and risk trying something else, I think, is a really good strategy.